"Well, then, I will do it," cried Franziska, in some measure regaining courage. "Whatever you may hear, whatever takes place inside the coffin," continued Voislav, "must have no effect upon you. Drive the nails well in without flinching. Your work must be finished before my prayer comes to an end." Franziska shuddered, but again recovered herself. "I will do it. Heaven will send me strength," she murmured softly. "There is one thing more," said Voislav hesitatingly. "Perhaps it is the hardest of all I have proposed, but without it your cure will not be complete. When you have done as I have told you, a sort of," he hesitated, "a sort of liquid will flow from the coffin. In this dip your finger and besmear the scratch on your throat." "Horrible!" cried Franziska. "This liquid is blood. A human being lies in the coffin." "An unearthly one lies therein. That blood is your own, but it flows in other veins," said Voislav gloomily. "Ask no more. The sand is running out." Franziska summoned up all her powers of mind and body, went towards the steps which led to the vault, and Voislav sank on his knees. Before the altar in quiet prayer. When the lady had descended, she found herself before the coffin on which lay the packet before mentioned. A sort of twilight reigned in the vault, and everything around was so still and peaceful that she felt more calm, and going up to the coffin opened the packet. She had hardly seen that a hammer and 3 long nails were its contents when suddenly Voislav's voice rang through the church and broke the stillness of the aisles. Franziska started, but recognized the appointed prayer. She seized one of the nails, and with one stroke of the hammer drove it at least an inch. Into the cover. All was still. Nothing was heard but the echo of the stroke. Taking heart, the maiden grasped the hammer with both hands and struck the nail twice with all her might, right up to the head into the wood. At this moment commenced a rustling noise. It seemed as though something in the interior began to move and to struggle. Franziska drew back in alarm. She was already on the point of throwing away the hammer and flying up the steps when Voislav raised his voice so powerfully, and it sounded so entreatingly, that in a sort of excitement, such as would induce one to rush into a lion's den, she returned to the coffin, determined to bring things to a conclusion. Hardly knowing what she did, she placed a second nail in the center of the lid, and after some strokes this was likewise buried to its head. The struggle now increased fearfully, as if some living creature were striving to burst the coffin. This was so shaken by it that it cracked and split on all sides. Half distracted, Franziska seized the third nail. She thought no more of her ailments. She only knew herself to be in terrible danger. Of what kind she could not guess. In an agony that threatened to rob her of her senses, and in the midst of the turning and cracking of the coffin, in which low groans were heard, she struck the third nail in equally tight. At this moment she began to lose consciousness. She wished to hasten away, but staggered, and mechanically grasping at something to save herself by, she seized the corner of the coffin and sank fainting beside it on the ground. A quarter of an hour might have elapsed when she again opened her eyes. She looked around her. Above was the starry sky. And the moon, which shed her cold light on the ruins and on the tops of the old oak trees. Franziska was lying outside the church walls, Voislav on his knees beside her, holding her hand in his. "Heaven be praised that you live," he cried with a sigh of relief. "I was beginning to doubt whether the remedy had not been too severe, and yet it was the only thing to save you." Franziska recovered her full consciousness very gradually. The past seemed to her like a dreadful dream. Only a few moments before that fearful scene, and now this quiet all around her. She hardly dared at first to raise her eyes, and shuddered when she found herself only a few paces removed from the spot where she had undergone such terrible agony. She listened half unconsciously, now to the pacifying words Voislard addressed to her, now to the whistling of the servant who stood by the horses, and who, to while away his time, was imitating the evening song of a belated cowherd. "Let us go," whispered Franziska as she strove to raise herself. "But what is this? My shoulder is wet. My throat. My hand. What is this? My shoulder is wet. My throat. My hand." "It is probably the evening dew on the grass," said Voislard gently. "No, it is blood!" she cried, springing up with horror in her tone. "See, my hand is full of blood." "Oh, you are mistaken, surely mistaken," said Voislard, stammering. "Or perhaps the wound on your neck may have opened. Pray, feel whether this is the case." He seized her hand and directed it to the spot. "I do not perceive anything. I feel no pain," she said at length, somewhat angrily. "Then, perhaps, when you fainted, you may have struck a corner of the coffin, or have torn yourself with the point of one of the nails," suggested Voislard. "Oh, of what do you remind me?" cried Franziska, shuddering. "Let us away, away, I entreat you, come. I will not remain a moment longer near this dreadful, dreadful place." They descended the path much quicker than they came. Voislard placed his companion on her horse, and they were soon on their way home. When they approached the castle, Franziska began to inundate her protector with questions about the preceding adventure, but he declared that her present state of excitement must make him defer all explanations till the morning, when her curiosity should be satisfied. On their arrival, he conducted her at once to her room, and he told the knight his daughter was too much fatigued with her ride to appear at the supper table. On the following morning, Franziska rose earlier than she had done for a long time. She assured her friend it was the first time since her illness commenced that she had been really refreshed by her sleep, and what was still more remarkable, she had not been troubled by her old terrible dream. Her improved looks were not only remarked by Bertha, but by Franz and the knight, and with Voislard's permission she related the adventures of the previous evening. No sooner had she concluded than Voislard was completely stormed with questions about such a strange occurrence. "Have you," said the latter, turning towards his host, "ever heard of vampires?" "Often," replied he, "but I have never believed in them." "Nor did I," said Voislard, "but I have been assured of their existence by experience." "Oh, tell us what occurred," cried Bertha eagerly as a light seemed to dawn on her. "Well, my lady, it was during my first campaign in Hungary," began Voislard, "when I was rendered helpless for some time by this sword-cut of a Janizary across my face, and another on my shoulder. I had been taken into the house of a respectable family in a small town. It consisted of the father and mother, and a daughter about 20 years of age. They obtained their living by selling the very good wine of the country, and the tap-room was always full of visitors. Although the family were well-to-do in the world, there seemed to brood over them a continual melancholy, caused by the constant illness of the only daughter, a very pretty and excellent girl. She had always bloomed like a rose, but for some months she had been getting so thin and wasted, and that without any satisfactory reason. They tried every means to restore her, but in vain. As the army had encamped quite in the neighborhood, of course a number of people of all countries assembled in the tavern. Amongst these there was one man who came every evening when the moon shone, who struck everybody by the peculiarity of his manners and appearance. He looked dried up and death-like, and hardly spoke at all, but what he did say was bitter and sarcastic. Most attention was excited towards him by the circumstance that, although he always ordered a cup of the best wine, and now and then raised it to his lips, the cup was always as full after his departure as at first. "Ah, sir, you did not drink your wine." "This all agrees wonderfully with the appearance of Azo," said Bertha, deeply interested. The daughter of the house, continued Voislaw, became daily worse, despite the aid not only of Christian doctors, but of many amongst the heathen prisoners, who were consulted in the hope that they might have some magical remedy to propose. It was singular that the girl always complained of a dream in which the unknown guest worried and plagued her. "Just the same as your dream, Franziska," cried Bertha. "One evening," resumed Voislaw, "an old Sclavonian, who had made many voyages to Turkey and Greece, and had even seen the New World, he and I were sitting over our wine, and sat down at the table. The bottle passed quickly between my friend and me, whilst we talked of all manner of things, of our adventures, and of passages in our lives, both horrible and amusing. We went on chatting thus for about an hour, and drank a tolerable quantity of wine. The unknown had remained perfectly silent the whole time, only smiling contemptuously every now and then. He now paid his money, and was going away. All this had quietly worried me. Perhaps the wine had got a little into my head, so I said to the stranger, "Hold, you stony stranger, you have hitherto done nothing but listen, and have not even emptied your cup. Now you shall take your turn in telling us something amusing, and if you do not drink up your wine, it shall produce a quarrel between us." "Yes," said the Sclavonian, "you must remain. You shall chat and drink too." And he grasped, for although no longer young, he was big and very strong, the stranger by the shoulder to pull him down to his seat again. The latter, however, although as thin as a skeleton, with one movement of his hand flung the Sclavonian to the middle of the room, and half stunned him for a moment. I now approached to hold the stranger back. I caught him by the arm, and although the springs of my iron hand were less powerful than those I have at present, I must have gripped him rather hard in my anger, for after looking grimly at me for a moment, he bent towards me and whispered in my ear, "Let me go from the gripe of your fist. I see you are my brother, therefore do not hinder me from seeking my bloody nourishment. I am hungry." Shocked by such words, I let him loose, and almost before I was aware he had left the room. As soon as I had in some degree recovered from my astonishment, I told the Sclavonian what I had heard. He started, evidently alarmed. I asked him to tell me the cause of his fears, and pressed him for an explanation of those extraordinary words. On our way to his lodging, he complied with my request. "The stranger," said he, "is a vampire." "How?" cried the knight, Franziska and Bertha simultaneously, in a voice of horror. "So this Azo was—" "Nothing less. He also was a vampire," replied Voislaw. "But at all events his hellish thirst is quenched for ever. He will never return. But I have not finished. As in my country vampires had never been heard of, I questioned the Sclavonian minutely. He said that in Hungary, Croatia, Dalmatia, and Bosnia these hellish guests were not uncommon. They were deceased persons who had either once served as nourishment to vampires, or who had died in deadly sin, or under excommunication. They were deceased persons who had either once served as nourishment to vampires, or who had died in deadly sin or under excommunication, and that whenever the moon shone they rose from their graves and sucked the blood of the living." "Horrible!" cried Franziska. "If you had told me all this beforehand, I should never have accomplished the work." "So I thought, and yet it must be executed by the sufferers themselves, while someone else performs the devotion," replied Voislaw. "The Sclavonian," he continued after a short pause, "added many other facts with regard to these unearthly visitants. He said that whilst their victim wasted, they themselves improved in appearance, and that a vampire possessed enormous strength." "Now I can understand the change your false hand produced on Azo," interrupted Franz. "Yes, that was it," replied Voislaw. "Azo, as well as the other vampire, mistook its great power for that of a natural one, and concluded I was one of his own species. You may now imagine, dear lady, he continued, turning to Franziska, how alarmed I was at your appearance when I arrived. All you and Bertha told me increased my anxiety, and when I saw Azo, I could doubt no longer that he was a vampire. As I learned from your account that a grave with the name Ezelin von Klatka lay in the neighborhood, I had no doubt that you might be saved if I could only induce you to assist me. It did not appear to me advisable to impart the whole facts of the case, for your bodily powers were so impaired that an idea of the horrors before you might have quite unfitted you for the exertion. For this reason, I arranged everything. For this reason I arranged everything in the manner in which it has taken place. You did wisely, replied Franziska, shuddering. I can never be grateful enough to you. Had I known what was required of me, I never could have undertaken the deed. That was what I feared, said Voislav, but fortune has favoured us all through. And what became of the unfortunate girl in Hungary? Inquired Bertha. That I know not, replied Voislav. That very evening there was an alarm of Turks, and we were ordered off. I never heard anything more of her. The conversation upon these strange occurrences continued for some time longer. The knight determined to have the vaulted Klatka walled up forever. This took place on the following day, the knight alleging as a reason that he did not wish the dead to be disturbed by irreverent hands. Franziska recovered gradually. Her health had been so severely shaken that it was long ere her strength was so much restored as to allow of her being considered out of danger. The young lady's character underwent a great change in the interval. Its former strength was perhaps in some degree diminished, but in place of that she had acquired a benevolent softness which brought all her best qualities. Franz continued his attentions to his cousin, but perhaps, owing to a hint from Bertha, he was less assiduous in his exhibition of them. His inclinations did not lead him to the battle, the camp, or the attainment of honours. His great aim was to increase the good condition and happiness of his tenants, and to this he contributed the whole energy of his mind. Franziska could not withstand the unobtrusive signs of the young man's continued attachment, and it was not long ere the credit she was obliged to yield to his noble efforts for the welfare of his fellow creatures changed into a liking, which went on increasing until at length it assumed the character of love. As Voislav insisted on making Bertha his wife before he returned to Silesia, it was arranged that the marriage should take place at their present abode. How joyful was the surprise of the Knight of Fannenberg when his daughter and Franz likewise entreated his blessing and expressed their desire of being united on the same day. That day soon came round, and it saw the bright looks of two happy couples. End of the mysterious